So I want to move from this area of sexuality to talk about this area of identity. And I had some questions from people during break. And one of the questions was, why didn't I say more in the first session about homosexuality? And certainly in the second session I will. When Aristotle's talking about sexuality, he has no problem. The Greeks have no problem with male-male friendship. They have no problem with male-male passion, love for each other. In fact, in the Greek world, it's probably the case that of all the relationships, male-male friendship was regarded to be the highest. But we live in a time in which we're told that you need to be married to be fulfilled, you need to be in a sexual relationship to be fulfilled. And so the idea is that if your eros, if your passion, if your attraction is toward the same sex, then you're gay, you're lesbian, that needs to be celebrated. And again, for Aristotle, it's what makes for the best possible relationship. And since it's not sex in that context, you're not thinking in terms of gay or lesbian. You're thinking of men who have passionate love for other men, women who have passionate love for other women. It's not seen to be a gay thing, a lesbian thing. But the question, why didn't you say more about that, begs this question of identity. And as big a deal as sex is in our time, I submit that the bigger deal of our moment is this question of identity. And they're very related. I mean, when we think of identity today, one of the first questions that people ask each other, they want to know, what's your sexual identity? And so in lots of conversations, people feel like they need to know your sexual identity so that they can know you. Because the idea is that identity is so interwrapped up today with sexuality. And I want to speak to this question of identity in this second part. We often, when we think of intellectual history, we think of classical, medieval, modern. When we think of classical, we think of the world in which we came to know what was true through philosophy. So epistemology is, in one sense, a study of how do you know what's true. And the idea was the classical world tends to be defined by philosophy. And it's not monolithic. There's lots of different philosophies. But the thought was that in that particular world, it was through philosophy we came to know what was true. In the medieval world, it was through theology, the revealed religions. The idea that either Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, the idea is that if we want to know what's true, we want to know what's true by looking at what does God say, what does Revelation say. There was confidence in that. And then in the latter part of the Middle Ages, we had the rise of what we call modern science. And the scientists came and said that certain teachings of the church when it came to the universe were wrong. Certain teachings of Aristotle, his cosmology, were wrong. That wasn't the case that the universe revolved around the earth, that the reality was that the earth revolved around the sun. Speaking rather flippantly, the reaction of the church was, we don't like what you're saying, and some of them lost their lives. And then later, when the church figured out that the scientists were right, they couldn't raise the scientists from the dead. And the church lost a lot of credibility. When the church gets something wrong, it loses credibility, not for a little time, but for a long time. So it's understandable people were asking the question, well, if Aristotle was wrong about this, if the church was wrong about that, what else is it wrong about? And we transition from what we call the medieval world to the modern world, a world in which we come to know what's true through science. And there was great optimism that science was going to not only teach us about this natural world in which we live in, but we have the advent in the early part of the 20th century of what we call social science, the idea that if we take the scientific method, apply it to the study of human beings, we'll be able to figure out the truth about what is a human being, how it is that we should act, etc. And so there was great faith in science. And in the early part of modernity, the philosophers, the theologians, the Puritans believed that if we studied revelation, we studied science, we studied philosophy, if we did it well, they would all agree. They'd be in harmony. But as time went on, the philosophers began to embrace some ideas that weren't consistent with the scripture, ancient philosophy. The scientists came along and embraced things that weren't necessarily consistent. And as people began to think more deeply about how do we know it's true, how do we know it's moral, and this question about whether science can teach humans about what is a moral way to live, there began to be doubt. David Hume, a British thinker, he said that you can't derive an ought from an is. You can't derive an ought from an is. Just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be. We could make a nuclear weapon. It is. Should we use it? It's an ought. We can do lots of genetic engineering. We can do that. That is. Should we? It's an ought. And when Hume writes that you can't derive an ought from an is, when Nietzsche comes along and says that there's no way that anybody can assert a moral statement that's not ultimately based on how we feel. People look at the intellectual world, the world of the scientific era. They say philosophy's been discredited, theology's been discredited, science is now discredited, and we move to this world of postmodernity. A world in which we're not so much looking at science, religion, philosophy. In postmodernity tends to be captured by the English departments. Postmodernity focuses on your narrative. You probably hear lots about what's your narrative, what's your story. And the idea that there's no such thing as an overarching story that explains everything. There's just little stories. Each of us has a little story. So what does all this have to do with identity? What does all this have to do with where we've got to today in this particular culture, where we're asking questions that 30 years ago we wouldn't necessarily have even thought to ask? Once we move to a moment at which there is no overarching story, we truly move to a world in which it's each and every one of us. Each and every one of us is the authority. Each and every one of us, we're the only ones that know who we are. Nobody else can tell us who we are. Rousseau began to speak in the 18th century. Rousseau is one of the first philosophers to say, if you want to know who you are, you need to look within. And we live in a time right now in which the culture is telling everybody, you want to know who you are? You got to look within. You want to know who you are? Nobody else can tell you who you are. You need to look within. And we live in a world now in which people are seeking to look within to try to figure out who they are. And as they seek to figure out who they are and explain it to somebody else, they want the world to affirm what they've discovered about who they are. And for quite a while now, we've lived in a moment in time in which people, when they think about who they are, when they look within, the big question they're asking themselves is, what is my sexual identity? Who am I? What does it mean to be true to myself? What is my sexual identity? And the biggest question, in one sense, in our culture is figuring out your sexual identity and then being affirmed for that, and then being encouraged to live out your life consistent with your identity, so long as you do it in a way that doesn't harm others, so long as you do it in such a way as it's whatever you do is consensual. Now here's the question. Can we know who we are by looking within? Rousseau's contemporaries said, it's not possible for a human being to understand who they are without a reference point outside of themselves. It's not possible for a human being to understand who they are without a reference point outside of ourselves. What I maintained earlier in the first lecture is that if we want to try to find happiness in sexual expression, it's not going to work. And what I want to maintain in this presentation is that if our identity is the only place we can figure out who we are is looking within, it will not work, even if the culture says that it will work. And as every year passes, there's evidence to suggest that not only this is true, but there's evidence to suggest that this is literally an unsustainable trajectory. What do I mean? In the 60s, there was a lot of encouragement to do sexual experimentation, love the one you're with. As we move into the 70s and 80s, the sexual expression is there and it's still important. But as each passing year goes by, there's this question, what is your sexual identity? And it's not just, I should love the one I'm with, male, female. There's this question about whether I'm gay and whether I'm lesbian. And so you'll find throughout the 80s and the 90s, both in the United States and in Europe, universities that begin to offer studies. In Europe, they'd call it queer studies. And in America, they would have various different examinations of it. But what we're primarily looking at is straight, gay, and lesbian. And it isn't that we're unaware of other possibilities. But in the 80s and in the 90s, that tended to be the focus. And as the 90s unfold, there's meetings where men in the gay movement come together and say, we want to push for same-sex marriage. And at that particular time, they're not looking for transgendered marriage. They're not looking for any of these other things. They're primarily focused on that. And one of the things that happened along the way is that in our quest for identity, male and female became less and less important. It's more and more the case today that it's not that important if we don't regard people so much as male and female, we regard them as persons. And as Andrew Sullivan, one of the architects of the same-sex marriage movement, said, and then when we got together and began to push for same-sex marriage, we didn't think we'd ever get it. But we thought we'd get a bunch of stuff along the way. What we didn't understand was that either the intended or unintended consequence of the feminist movement was neutering humanity. And once people began to look at human beings primarily as persons, rather than male-female, then the question became, why can't two persons get married? And even though we didn't realize it, that was the point at which we won. It may take a few years to play itself out, but we've won. Because we now live in a nation, we now live in a culture in the West in which it's primarily not male and female that's at issue. It's primarily persons. And who are any of us to stand in the way of two persons who want to do something that's consensual and that doesn't harm? If we can have whatever happiness we can have in conjunction with our own identity as we understand it, why would we rob somebody else of that? And anybody who's seen as robbing somebody else of that is seen to be robbing people of their possibility for happiness. So this presentation is going to get a little bit more Twilight Zone. Time magazine recently had this cover story about the transgender tipping point. And so we've changed as a culture that as a culture we're not merely talking about male, female, we're not merely talking about persons, we're not merely talking about gay and lesbian, we're talking about transgender. And in moving from gay and lesbian to transgender, we're actually moving to a completely different category. Gay and lesbian is ultimately predicated on male, female. I'm a male. who's attracted to males. I'm a female attracted to female. Gay and lesbian, in one sense, affirms gender identity. Transgender moves to this area of, what if I'm in a man's body, but I'm really a female? And so we're moving away from gendered to a new category of, when I look within, what do I feel? Now let me make this clear with an illustration that I've had, a conversation I had with an 8th grader at church not long ago. The 8th grader comes up and says to me, "Pastor Dale, I want you to know I figured out who I am." And I said, "That's great. I'm a horse." Okay. I said, it's kind of, wow. They didn't teach me in seminary how to respond to something like that. So I asked, I said, I would have said you were a woman. So she asks the question, she says, "Well, what does it feel like to be a woman?" I said, "I don't know." "Well, what does it feel like to be a man?" I said, "I don't know." She says, "Exactly. The reason I'm a horse is that when I look out at the world, I identify more closely with horses than I do with anybody else." The student is educated in an educational system. So we've got a state where same-sex marriage is legal. We've got a state in which we're moving toward lots of different things. And where it's legal, an educational system can't tell a student what's right and wrong when it comes to marriage, when it comes to gender. What an educational system can do is say to a young person, "It's up to you to figure out who you are. It's up to you to figure out what your values are. It's up to you to figure those things out." How does an 8th grader know who they are? How does a 7th grader know who they are? And what this 8th grader came to the conclusion was, after thinking about it, it's not possible to look within and figure out what it feels like to be a man. It's not possible to look within and figure out what it feels like to be a woman. I can figure out what my sexual attraction is. The question about what does it feel like to be a man doesn't work. Now, our culture right now tends to have a lot of focus on same-sex marriage, understandably. Our Time magazine is suggesting we're moving to a new place, the transgender tipping point. If we were to begin to talk to middle school kids in New England, California, I can't speak about Colorado, they've moved beyond both of those things. In doing some research, I figured out in July that Facebook had 56 different options for gender. And now it's up to over 70. And it's really good when you say spontaneously, "What?" But what we need to realize is this is not illogical. If you tell a generation of young kids it's up to themselves to figure out who they are, and some kids rebel against older people. So should it be the case that adults are talking about same-sex marriage and transgender and sexual identity, why should it be the case that 8th graders would decide we should be like the adults and talk about sexual identity? Why wouldn't it be the case that you'd begin to explore other things? And there's another reason for this. We've discovered in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I live, and they've also discovered this in San Francisco, and scholars are discovering this in various parts of the country. If you interview high school students right now, they're having less sex with each other than they did 5 years ago. So, of course, this asks the question, and lots of academics look at this and say, we must have finally got sex education right. When you listen to what the kids say, what they'll say is this: that by the time they get to be seniors in high school, they've been exposed to so much pornography. 50% of young people are exposed to hardcore pornography, HD pornography, at the age of 14. By the time they become seniors, they've been exposed to so much pornography and they've done enough experimentation that they're becoming bored with sex. And so that the reason why they're finding that students are having less sex as they get to high school is that they're beginning to get bored with it. It's not necessarily true for the college students, the people in their 20s and their 30s, but it is true of them. And so there's another reason why it is that when young people begin to think about, what is my identity? If sex isn't doing it for me, what am I? And if you've already decided that if I look within, I really don't know, how can I know what it is to be anything? And what I want to submit is that it's not possible for us to live in a world in which people are taught and told that they have to look within to figure out who they are. That it is the definition of being lost. That we're up to over 70 different gender associations on Facebook, and why will it stop there? And that if I look within and I don't know what it is to be male and female, who is it in this world that I identify with? What is it that I identify with? I don't know whether Colorado Christian University students explore other kins. But if not, you can go explore other kins, which is what my 8th graders explore, to begin to look at all the different possibilities for who they might be in terms of animals and spirits and etc. Now, you may say you're glad that I'm going to fly back to New Hampshire soon because this is a little bit weird. But we live in a world in which the world is asking us, affirm us for who we are, whatever it is that we say who we are. And what I want to simply say is, it is a world that won't work. I can't stand up here and say, I can prove in a way every human being will accept that we're all made in the image of God, male and female, and that's fundamentally who we are, and if the only way we can find ourselves is to get into that. I could say that, not everybody's going to believe me, but what I can say, and I can say from the deepest part of my being, is that the world that we've presently constructed and the trajectory we are on is simply won't work. As we become more and more fragmented, as we become more and more individualistic, as we become more and more focused on looking within to figure out who we are, we're losing the ability to relate to other people. Think about it. If you accept the notion that nobody else can tell you who you are, then you are basically saying, nobody else will ever be able to know me. You are basically saying that you are condemned to a lonely existence. You will live in proximity with people. You may live in relationship with people, but you will be with people who will never fully understand who you are. They won't understand who you are. You won't understand who they are. And there's a certain solitude and loneliness to this. Is it any wonder that we live in a time where the narrative is really not embracing same-sex marriage? The narrative of our moment is losing faith in marriage. We live at a time in which young people are delaying marriage. And the question for 18 to 29-year-olds is are they delaying marriage or are they not going to get married? And based on my experience with my own college students, I'm increasingly persuaded that they won't get married because they're losing faith in the idea that they will ever be able to be in a lifelong relationship with something that can build and that can grow and be sustaining. They're increasingly persuaded that they'll have to settle for, or the best they can get, is the hope that during their lifetime they'll be able to have 2 or 3 relationships that can sustain them through. It's anecdotal. Last semester I had 2 different women students, female students, come into my office, and in conversation they basically said the following: I need to go to grad school and have a career so that when I get married and my marriage fails, I'll have something to fall back on. I would maintain the biggest crisis of our day is not the crisis of sexual activity. The biggest crisis of our day is the crisis of relational hope. We live in a time in which people are losing faith in the idea that they will be able to be in relationships that work. 43% of our kids in America are born outside of marriage. We probably come to the place in the first time in American history where a majority of Americans will never be married. This change in dating trajectory and other things, I'm not saying it's in Colorado. Let me speak about my own family. I have 3 kids, 31, 29, 27. None are married. Fit the demographic perfectly. My 31-year-old's in a cohabiting relationship. Is it that I didn't rear her well, that she doesn't understand stuff, etc.? I think she decided it was her only chance to be in a relationship that looked like marriage. Will they get married? I hope so. Because I want my wife to quit asking me when we're going to have grandchildren. I want them to get married and have kids. I just want that to happen. My 29-year-old daughter, terrific, hasn't had a date since college. Dating culture is dead. Part of it is that in New Hampshire you don't go to church to meet people your age because we only have 70 people in church on average and they're not all in their 20s. And the dating culture tends to be go to bar and hook up. And my daughter doesn't want to do the online thing. And then my 27-year-old son. And they're typical. We live in a moment in which we're losing relational hope. We live in a culture that's losing relational hope. But you may ask, well, what's so bad with that? Why won't it work? What we are discovering is that a nation can't survive without family. A nation can't survive without family. Now, some of you have pegged me as a liberal or a conservative or who knows what right now. So now maybe you're pegging me as a conservative. A nation can't survive without family. That's not self-evident in America, but it's almost self-evident in every other nation on the earth, and here's why. It costs the government between 4 and 8 times more money for a child to be born outside of a marriage than in a marriage. Now you might say, well, why is the social scientist so vague, 4 to 8 times? We have a really good understanding of what it costs a society for a child to be born outside of marriage between 0 and 18. But what we're discovering is that if a child isn't taken care of by their parents, when the parents get elderly, the child doesn't take care of them. Of those 43% of kids born outside of marriage, over 60% of them will identify 5 parent figures in their life between 0 and 18. It's expensive for a society to deal with a child outside of marriage, but it is not possible for a society to be financially viable and care for the elderly. The cost of the care of the elderly is astronomical. The family is the best economic bargain a government has. And the problem is, governments around the world recognize that if they can't keep family together, they can't be financially viable as a society. Germany, not exactly known as a hotbed of religious conservatism. The German High Court ruled earlier this year that a middle-aged man had to pay the German government 8,000 euros for the care of his father, even though his father disowned him when he left home. But the German High Court ruled that because the father took care of the child until he was 18, the child was obligated to do this. Does 8,000 euros cover the care? Not even close. But what the Germans recognize is that if children won't take care of parents, they are not financially viable. So why is this particular truth that is recognized by the Chinese government, the Australian government, the European Union, England, South Africa, nations all over the world, why is this particular thing that is on their radar, why is it not on the radar of the United States? It's not on the radar of the United States because other people buy our debt. $16 trillion in borrowing for the government. Not far behind is consumer debt of 15.9. Farther behind is student debt of $1 billion, but we don't want to talk about that. In the United States, we live as though economic physics doesn't work, doesn't matter. But there will come a day when people quit buying our debt. There will come a day in which we have to pay our bills. And what other governments around the world are saying is not, we need to embrace conservative Christian sexual attitudes. They're not saying we need to embrace conservative Christian ideas of family. They're not saying that. What they're saying is, we've got to get people to marry and stay married to be financially viable, and we've got to figure out how to do it. Chinese government. The one-child policy may be problematic for some of us because of selective abortion and all sorts of different things. But economically, it's a big problem for China. Child is born, usually it's a boy. You've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents doting on child. This boy grows up, gets married. Gets married, wants wife to dote on him, just like parents and grandparents doted on him. Big surprise, wife doesn't want to dote. The unofficial divorce rate in Shanghai is 80%. And what the Chinese government realizes is they can't sustain their nation with this. I would argue this is the fundamental reason why China is not the economic power that'll threaten the United States and Europe. How has China responded? You may have heard something called the Alpha Marriage Course. They've commissioned the Alpha Marriage Course, which comes out of Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London, to translate the marriage course into Mandarin, and they're requiring it be taught to Chinese because there's evidence to suggest that if you take the Alpha Marriage Course, it helps your marriage be better. Now, if you're to ask me, how in the world does that work? I have no idea. But the point is, studies have shown it. The Chinese need to find something that works, so they're embracing it. We're living at a time in which our culture, our nation is saying, be who you want to be. Build your own identity. Be true to yourself. And what we're finding is people are getting lost in the abyss of the self. They're getting lost in the self. They're disconnecting with others. They're losing faith in relationship. And this is a trajectory that will not work. Not controversial. I say, my God, this guy's depressing. I'm sure glad we don't have him teach politics. You know, Western civilization could fall. It might be that no matter how hard we try, we won't be able to save America, we won't be able to save the West. But you know something? When Rome fell, when civilizations fell, there's this really interesting phenomenon. The day after the sun comes up. And we find that when Rome fell apart, there was economic chaos, there was relational chaos, sexual chaos. Caesar Augustus said his number one public policy failure in Rome was that he couldn't get people to marry and stay married. Rome falls apart. The sun comes up. What do people discover? They discover each other. They rediscover family. They rediscover relationship. And they begin to get in touch with what I believe to be true, which I think can be seen in Scripture, which I think can be seen in Aristotle, which I think can be seen in this world, is that we are made for relationship. None of us can know who we are without a reference point outside of ourselves. And the big question for everybody that walks the face of the earth is, what is our reference point going to be? I believe that the most certain of all reference points is Jesus Christ. I believe that the most certain of all reference points is God. That when we get to know God, we can get to know who we are. That we find that every single person that walks the face of the earth is born male and female. That they're made in the image of God. And that despite the various things toward which we might be inclined that are not helpful to us, whether it's sexuality, materialism, you name it, the reality is that the fundamental truth about each one of us, it is true that we're sinners, but the more fundamental truth is that we are made in the image of God and loved by God, and Jesus Christ died for each one of us. And that when we meet our fellow human being as walks the earth, what we need to encounter, what they need to feel from us, is that they need to hear from us that they are made in the image of God, that they are loved. And that when it comes to challenging each one of us to change, challenging each one of us to change our trajectory, Jesus handles that better than we can. That we're living in a time in which more and more people are coming to us and say, affirm my identity no matter what it is. It's the case when people come to us now, you're going to have to get out a dictionary to figure out what identity they're saying they have. And I, quite frankly, when I read Facebook identities, I've got to get the dictionary out, Urban Dictionary, because I'm not getting it, even with the dictionary.